Hi, and welcome to my channel. It's April and it's officially springtime. In this video, I'm going to be discussing the important gardening tasks you should be completing in the month of April, along with everything that you can start from seeds or transplant into your garden. Hi, my name is Jara. I teach people how to garden, grow food, raise backyard chickens, and keep bees. If these homesteading type topics interest you, make sure you subscribe to my channel because I post new videos on a daily basis to inspire and educate others. So let's get started with this April gardening guide. The goal for the month of April is to get as many things planted as possible. It's like the final check or the final rehearsal to make sure that everything's planted and set up properly so that I could sit back, watch my plants grow, and then ultimately within the next couple months start harvesting a huge spring harvest. First, I'm going to discuss the April to-do list, and then I'll be going through each and every crop that you can either start from seed or transplant. If you're past your last average spring frost date, go ahead and try and direct sow as many things as you possibly can. I would say for the majority of the United States, we're all starting to get past our last average spring frost date, but there are a few of you in the colder climates or zones where you still have to wait until May for your last spring frost date to finally pass. If you're still waiting, then now is the opportunity for you to start seeds indoors. That way you get a jump start on your spring season. Right now, I am walking around my garden and kind of analyzing things. I'm trying to identify bare spots in my garden or spaces that are unused that I can hurry up and squeeze in maybe a grow bag or some kind of containers. That way I can plant as much as possible. I would also say this is a good month to start developing your fertilization plan. As things are growing, it's really helpful to give them a consistent supply of nutrients. Personally, I like to use organic granular fertilizer because I can give small doses on a weekly basis to my plants without having to worry about overdosing them on synthetic stuff, which can also burn your plants. Springtime is also a great time to plant new fruit trees. The goal with fruit trees is to have them get a little bit established in their new spot before the heat and stress of summer arrives. No matter where you're located in the country, I always recommend that you buy your fruit trees from a local nursery, because they will always carry the varieties that will produce well in your area. If you're in Florida, it's also dry season, so make sure you give your fruit trees extra water to help them make it through and get established. Springtime is also when you start seeing a surge in pest populations. And I'm talking about all kinds of pests: aphids, stink bugs, squash bugs, worms. They're all waking up from winter and they're repopulating the garden. So be on the extra watch out for these pests. You're also going to see an uptick in leaf diseases. That could be powdery mildew, blight, yellow spots. I have one treatment for them all, and that's 1 cup of hydrogen peroxide per gallon of water spray. With both pests and diseases, you want to treat for them as soon as you identify the problem. The longer you wait, the more it will spread in your garden, and that will require more treatments. So just be ready for these things so that way you'll have a successful spring garden. All right, so let's get into the crops. By the way, if you need plants or seeds for anything I'm going to mention in this video, you can find them on my website, jarasgarden.com. The first crop, and probably one of the easiest for everyone to grow, are beans. There's bush beans, pole or vining beans, winged beans, lima beans, and if you're in zones 8 and up, yard-long beans. I really like to grow the vining or the pole beans, like this purple potted bean right here, because it's easier to harvest. I can just pluck them off my trellises instead of having to bend over to harvest the smaller bush beans. You can go ahead and start direct sowing seeds for beans, but if you have issues with germination, maybe your soil is too soggy and the seeds rot out, or critters like to eat them up, you can actually start seeds for beans in 72 cell seed trays. I simply plant just 1 seed per cell, and they are ready to transplant at around the 3-week mark. If you're in a colder climate and you're still waiting for all danger of frost to pass, you can backtrack 3 weeks, start your bean seeds in the 72 cell seed trays, and then you'll kind of get an early head start on your season. If you're a beginner gardener, I always recommend beans because seriously, they're ready to harvest usually around 2 to 2.5 months. My personal favorite that I recommend no matter where you're gardening is the rattlesnake pole bean because it's super productive and it tolerates a wide range of different conditions. Let's talk about some of the greens that you can still plant in the month of April. You could get away with transplanting some mustard greens if you get them in immediately. Try to choose the varieties that are more heat tolerant, like this beautiful ultraviolet mustard green. You still have time to start some of the more heat tolerant Asian greens like tatsoi and bok choy from seed. One of my favorite things to do is to walk around my garden and sprinkle seeds for tatsoi or bok choy in any bare spots. If you're in a warmer zone like zones 8 and up, it's very beneficial to plant any of your greens in a spot that gets a lot of bright morning sun but full afternoon shade. You could also start some of the more tropical greens like Molokhia and New Zealand spinach. They're easily started from seed, so I recommend that you start them in 4-inch pots or containers and then transplant them into your garden as soon as the root system starts to develop and overtake the container, but before it's root bound. Other heat-tolerant tropical greens include longevity spinach, Okinawan spinach, katuk, and shiso spinach. These plants are not really started from seed. Instead, you would be transplanting them into your garden. If you're past your last average spring frost date, it's time to direct sow seeds for corn. The number one thing with corn is that it's wind pollinated, so you need to have a nice thick block with multiple plants to get proper pollination. Usually corn is very easy to just direct sow the seeds, but sometimes you might have issues. Like for me, my soil tends to be really moist and that encourages the seeds to just rot out. Or some of us have critters that like to dig out the seeds and eat them. If that's the case, you can easily start corn in 72 cell seed trays. You're basically growing your own transplants and they are ready to go into the garden at the 3-week mark. April is also a great month to start direct sowing seeds for cucumbers, Seminole pumpkins, tromboncino rampicante, and any kind of summer or winter squashes. I like to make a little mound and plant at least 2 seeds per mound. That way I don't forget that I've planted them there. If your last average spring frost date hasn't passed yet, you could definitely start all of those crops in containers indoors. That way they'll be a nice transplant size so you can immediately get them into the garden as soon as your last average spring frost date has passed. The number one thing I would say to watch out for when you're trying to grow seedlings for, cucumbers, squashes, is to monitor the plants for pests. Squash bugs, and in particular worms, really like to munch on the leaves of tender young seedlings. And you'll find that if you get your seedlings to survive and they start growing into a more mature state, they can resist the pests a lot easier. Let's talk about peppers and eggplants. If you're past your last average spring frost date, then use transplants. If you're still waiting for your spring frost date to pass, then start them from seed indoors in something bigger like a solo cup. They are ready to transplant once the root system starts overtaking the solo cup, but before it gets root bound. One tip for gardeners that are in climates with very hot summers like me here in Florida, I like to plant my eggplants and peppers in a spot that gets a lot of morning sun, but some afternoon shade, because they really start to struggle when temperatures are consistently above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Also, if you didn't know, peppers and eggplants are perennial. They easily die if they're exposed to freezing temperatures. So if you're in a colder climate, you can winterize your peppers and eggplants by digging them out of the ground, trying to conserve as much of the root system as possible, and just bringing them indoors. Then you can transplant them back into the garden next spring as soon as all danger of frost has passed. This eggplant right here is Rosa Bianca. It's an Italian heirloom and it's my favorite for making eggplant parmesan. If you want to learn more about growing eggplants from seed all the way to harvest, check out my full eggplant growing tutorial here on YouTube. Let's talk about everyone's favorite summer crop, tomatoes. Hear me out because this is going to get very specific depending on where you're located. If you are passing your last average spring frost date in the month of April, use transplants. If your last spring frost date falls in the month of May, then you need to start them from seed indoors right now. I like to sow seeds for tomatoes in solo cups because that will house them until they are ready to be transplanted in about 6 to 8 weeks. If you are in garden zones 9 and up, like me here in Orlando, Florida, I'm zone 9B, it is too late to plant anything tomatoes. You should have had them in the ground by now. March is actually the last month I recommend that you transplant your tomatoes into the ground, because the goal with hot climates like 9 and up is to harvest everything before summer arrives. Once temperatures start getting over 90 degrees Fahrenheit consistently, which is our summer here in Florida, the tomato plants have issues pollinating. You'll notice that they start dropping a lot of their flowers or they don't even bloom at all. So even if you get your tomato plants to survive all of the pests and diseases that they will get during the summer here in Florida, they're not going to really produce for you because they're dropping their flowers and not able to properly pollinate because of the high temperatures. So just letting my fellow Floridians know, tomatoes is not a summer crop for us like the rest of the country. It's actually the opposite. We grow these during fall, winter, and spring. If you want to try growing some anyways, then you can maybe get away with growing the cherry types because they have a higher disease and pest resistance than like the beefsteaks, for example. If you are past your last spring frost date, you can direct sow seeds for watermelons, cantaloupes, or any kinds of melons. If you're still waiting for your last spring frost date to pass, then start them indoors in a bigger size container like a solo cup. Melons like a lot of nutrients, so make sure you add some fertilizer into the planting hole. If you're past your last average spring frost date, it's also time to direct sow seeds for cowpeas, southern peas, and okra. All of the peas are very easily started from direct sowing seeds right into the ground. One of my favorite things to do with them is to plant them underneath all of my fruit trees because they kind of sprawl out and they block out weeds from growing. You could also direct sow seeds for okra, but I really like to start them in solo cups just so I can monitor the seedlings a little better. If you plan on growing loofah, moringa, or snake bean, you really want to get them into the ground as soon as your last spring frost date has passed. These crops require many months in a row of warm temperatures to be able to start producing. Loofah, for example, is going to require at least 6 to 9 months from seed all the way to harvest. If you haven't passed your last spring frost date yet, then definitely start these crops in solo cups indoors. And then pop them into the garden as soon as all danger of frost is passed. And I have a couple YouTube videos showing you how to get faster germination on both loofah and moringa, so go check those out. Let's talk about flowers. If you're past your last frost date, then you can start direct sowing tons of seeds for flowers anywhere you can find. I literally start walking around my garden and I start throwing seeds for all sorts of flowers to get them to grow. Some of my favorites include zinnias, marigolds, cosmos, these nasturtiums, and sunflowers. They are very easy to start from seed, and usually you can start enjoying blooms within 2 to 3 months. I particularly love nasturtiums because they are a trap crop for aphids, they attract beneficial insects, and these beautiful flowers are edible. So I have a bunch of them growing in between my tomatoes, like this one right here. And I haven't had an aphid problem with my tomatoes as of yet. 2 more of my favorite flowers include roselle and Thai double blue butterfly pea. Both of those flowers thrive in warmer climates like mine, and you can use them to make tea. If you're past your last spring frost date, it's time to plant root crops. Some of my favorites include ginger, used for culinary purposes, shampoo ginger, and turmeric. These are planted by rhizomes, which could take a couple weeks to sprout. Personally, I like to plant them in 1-gallon containers, and once I see that they have sprouted, then I will transplant them into the garden. You should expect to start harvesting ginger and turmeric in about 6 to 9 months. Shampoo ginger is a little bit different. You're growing that for the flowers and the liquid that you harvest from it. It usually takes a full season for the root system to get big enough to start outputting those flowers. If you're in zones 9 and up, you can start planting a lot of tropical root crops. Some of these include yucca, cassava, galangal, malanga, taro, and not a root crop, but sugarcane. It's a good idea to start planting them now because it's nice and warm outside, and then you'll give them the whole summer to really grow and get established. That way you'll have a nice big harvest. If you're in zones 9 and up, you can also plant a lot of fruit crops, such as ground cherries, pineapples, passion fruit, and papaya. It's a good idea to get those into the ground as soon as possible. That way when summer arrives, they'll really start taking off and growing. I hope you enjoyed this guide and it gave you a lot of ideas for crops that you can grow in your spring garden. If you want this guide in written form to copy it, print it, or share it with others, you can find it on my website, jarahsgarden.com, under the monthly growing guide section. Or you can sign up for my email newsletter. There's a link in the description below, and have the monthly growing guide sent to your email automatically on the 1st of every month. I hope you have a successful spring gardening season, and thank you for watching.